Chapter 21. Furious. Anthea dug through her bag looking for first aid supplies. Elle had a nasty cut on their cheek, which needed to be cleaned and stitched up immediately. A simple bandage wasn't going to fix this one. It was much too deep, and to be honest, she was too afraid to see just how deep it went. Anthea felt queasy just thinking about it. She could barely look at them, and instead focused on finding the first aid supplies, while ensuring Elle they were going to be okay, and giving them caring and comforting pats while they cried. She found her first aid supplies and prepped her tools to fix Elle's injury. It hurt. A lot. Anthea began to stitch the wound together, and Elle winced. They couldn't help but cry, no matter how hard they tried to hold it back. Elle was starting to enjoy their adventure with Anthea. They were finally starting to feel more brave, like they could do anything without Sam or their parents' help. Elle sat there crying while Anthea fixed them up. She did her best to assure Elle everything was okay and that her stitching would be over soon, but Elle didn't seem to pay her any attention. Anthea finished the job and put a bandage on their cheek.
Do you want a piece of candy? I save them for times like this. When I'm off on long errands for Aunt Witch, I sometimes get homesick,
Anthea said, looking at Elle with a worried but hopeful face. Elle didn't reply and instead sat on the ground with their hands over their eyes, crying. Anthea felt really bad for Elle. Ending up in an unknown location so far from home and running into so many strong and dangerous monsters, it was no wonder the poor kid was having a meltdown. She didn't know what to do as she stood on their shoulder, holding a piece of candy and feeling helpless. She put the piece of candy back into her bag and hugged Elle around their neck. Well, as best as she could manage at her small size.
I'm sorry, Elle,
she said. Elle hiccuped and wiped their tears off their cheeks. They felt a lot better having Anthea here. It was no Sam hug, but it would do.
Take your time to relax. I'm going to look around the area and see where we ended up,
she said, rummaging through her bag once again.
And here's the piece of candy if you change your mind.
She placed the sweet on their shoulder and hopped down to the ground and headed towards some nearby bushes. They landed in a densely wooded area, so surely Elle was hidden enough by the trees, keeping them safely hidden from nearby enemies. The trees also added cover from the passing storm, keeping it fairly dry. Before she headed in, she turned around and looked at Elle, who had picked up the piece of candy and was happily munching away at it. She smiled and continued on. Anthea surveyed the area. Surprisingly, the bird had gotten them most of the way to Aunt Witch's place before they were attacked by that cloud monster. That poor bird. She could only assume it didn't make it out of the clouds, but she hoped for the best. As she walked through the forest, she kept an eye out for any signs of a familiar location when she heard a rustle in the bushes and quickly readied her sword. But there was nothing. Then she heard Elle scream.
Oh no, Elle!
She rushed back to where she left Elle, only to find them alone, yet looking very scared.
Elle, what's wrong?
She asked as she approached them. Elle's back was facing her, and when she rounded the corner,
Antonio?
Anthea shouted in surprise.
Is that really you?
She stood there in shock for a moment as she stared at the ant holding his weapon towards Elle, who was still sitting on the ground scared from the little ant's threat. At first, Anthea's eyes lit up. She was so relieved to see her cousin Antonio after all this time of thinking they were to never return from their trip. And then, she became furious. Before Antonio could even say hi, Anthea started to lecture him.
All this time and you couldn't send a single letter? We were so worried about you. Any sort of sign that you were still alive would have been great, you know.
Elle let out a sigh of relief. Not only were they in no danger, but in the end, they didn't kill Antonio at the festival. Elle laughed as they watched Anthea scold Antonio. Maybe things were finally starting to turn around for their adventure home.